Okay, so in the first section of our conversation, we talked about who Crystal is, what her team is. We also discussed Deliberate Lab, the tool that Crystal's team has developed, which is for running group studies featuring involvement from large language models, either as, say, mediators and facilitators, or potentially as participants for testing purposes. We also discussed some of the studies that Crystal ran using the tool, including an election study on this lost at sea task where participants had to rank items they thought would be most useful in the context of being lost at sea. And another, which was an economic study focused on investigating the trading behaviors of language models, people, and Bayesian agents in a chip trading game. Conversation was so wide-ranging. There's even another topic that we covered, which was how you think about the role of language models and language model agents in group settings, and how can they enrich them? How could they potentially amplify damaging dynamics? In the second section of our conversation, we're going to talk about 3 different areas. 1, open infrastructure, open tooling, open source. Deliberate Lab is open source. That means that you, listener, can go and check it out, use it yourself, run a study with it yourself. 2, methodology, and talking about the challenges of running these types of studies and what you've learned about running them successfully, if you like. And then finally, we'll look away from the present and into the future and talk about, what are the effects you would like to see Deliberate Lab have had in a few years' time, and what research directions you personally are currently really excited about. So I'm really curious to know how you thought about open sourcing Deliberate Lab. I think what open sourcing, particularly if you're in a big organization, can be a challenging thing to consider because, for one, you might find this tool has the potential for abuse. Or for another, you don't want to commit to supporting this tool for a wider user base. You don't necessarily want your tool to be used by everybody because it's a drag when, everybody's coming to you with their problems and is trying to get you to do free work for them. God bless those that do choose to make that decision. I'm curious to know, how did your team think about open sourcing?
Yeah, I mean, as a scientist and a developer, my bias is always towards let's open source. In this particular case where our goals were to, evangelize other research in the space, make this kind of research more accessible, the benefits of open sourcing, in our opinion, far outweighed the harms. But there is this, balance we need to make between safely open sourcing these things. Like you said, there could be potential for bad actors here. And so there's a few layers to this, and we have a mixed rollout strategy where all of the code is open source on GitHub. You can fork it and you can create your own deployment if you want. But there's also a Google hosted deployment with a closed allow list, and you can sign up on our website if you're interested and you describe your use case. The reason why we personally host a deployment is because we were thinking about these multidisciplinary developers in mind, or not developers. We were thinking about these multidisciplinary scientists and policymakers and other types of researchers that we want in the room doing these kinds of studies. And for them, we want to collaborate closely and make sure that they have the setup they need, which is why we run our deployment. You can just create your experiment there. But over the past year, we've also heard from teams with more specific use cases. For example, maybe there's sensitive data or sensitive topics, or medical data is a whole branch of security and privacy on its own. And for those cases, we want to make sure that they can be as tightly controlled as they want. And so we provide very specific deployment instructions. If you want to set up your own instance of the server, we'll work with you to set that up. And this kind of our own deployment / hosting on open source is the compromise and balance we've found between, making this research accessible versus making sure that it's used safely and responsibly.
Awesome. So it sounds like you're very keen to work quite closely with users and promote research using the tool, and not simply say like act as maintainers of the tool, if you like, and just like, oh, people benefit as a fringe thing from the work that you're doing on the platform.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually like a core goal of yours now is to share this tool with the world and to promote research into group dynamics.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, hindsight is 2020, but open sourcing has been so good for us. We've reaped so many benefits from the open source community. I've mentioned before that, we were pretty focused on our own specific use case, and the kinds of features that folks are bringing in are making us aware of different types of research being done in the space. So it's great for visibility reasons. It's great for future reasons as well. At this point, folks from the open source community have contributed a lot of features and things. It's truly a collaboration and not really, here's a tool we can use. We hope you can use it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And I hope that people listening do go and try it out. We will share a link to the hosted version.
Great.
And if somebody does want to try it out, what's the flow that they need to go through? Because it's currently in closed beta, right?
Mm-hmm.
What steps do they need to go through to start working with the tool?
Sure. Well, there's two options. If you're interested in using the Google hosted version, you just fill out this form explaining your use case, and we can see whether it would make sense for us to support it. But if you want to get started today, you can fork the open source repository and set up your own instance.
And one of the beautiful aspects of open source is not only that you share your tool with everyone, share your work with everyone, but also everybody can contribute to building the tool and developing the tool.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious to know what you would love to see contribute to the platform, and what contributions you think are most pressing, or I feel like urgent isn't quite the right word, but what would you love to see contributed to Deliberate?
I really like this question. In terms of the kinds of things that I've seen, we've talked about bot detection. That is a constantly evolving field, and we see updated features for this contributed every so often, starting from very simple ones such as disabling copy-paste on text input boxes to more sophisticated tracking. In terms of just how the platform has exponentially grown in usage over the past year, any kind of feature that would help us scale experimenter attention would be very helpful to a lot of projects I can think of working on the platform, including ours. So, making sure that right now experimenters fire attention checks when they feel like someone is lagging behind, for example. Can we automate that process? Can we automate transferring or any kind of behavior that requires the attention of the experimenter whose attention is limited? Finally, I want to plug that we do have a wish list tag on our GitHub repository. So if you're a developer looking for a feature to take on, please, look up our wish list, and that would be a very, very nice Christmas present.
Are there specific developer skill sets? I'm really keen to highlight hooks here.
Mm-hmm.
Specific developer skill sets like technologies, languages that you think would be particularly most well felt, or the tool would benefit from a lot of attention from.
Sure. So the platform is built in TypeScript, but one thing I've noticed, and I want to be careful here because I know that there's a lot of different opinions on vibe coding, but I think that we're at the point with assisted capabilities where you really don't need to be a developer to make a contribution. And often the kinds of contributions we see from folks that aren't so much in the technology space are the ones that are surprising to us as a feature to contribute. One thing there, actually, a fourth thing to add to the wish list, is as the platform grows and there are more contributions, we could always use better rigor testing. Right now, the difference, the line between deploying this feature is just folks on the team that are reviewing these pull requests and making sure that the features are good. But as these features are potentially vibe coded, as they're being contributed with people with different expertise and coding styles, anything to make that process easier would be very welcomed.
I think one thing that would be interesting to dig into here is, say someone listening, they click that link and they go through to this hosted version of Deliberate Lab, and they're in a position where they can start to run a study for themselves. What advice would you give them? What have you learned from seeing many experiments run on the platform, running many experiments for yourself? What sort of gotchas are there to look out for, or things that you encourage them to focus on in developing their own study?
Oh, good question. My advice would be to start with one of the quick start templates. Once you start, they say, hey, the platform will offer you, why don't you create a simple group chat experiment? Or why don't you create this situation without an AI? And I think that can be a much less intimidating introduction to the platform. And then I would advise you to go through it as a participant, because once you do that, you'll get it. One of the blessings and also challenges of having this platform support so many different use cases is that it is deeply configurable. So if you just jump into the platform creating an experiment from scratch, you're going to see a lot of configurability and options, and you'll think, oh, do I need structured output in my AI? Do I care about all of these temperature settings? What does it mean for all of these stages to have metadata like status indicators for participants? And that intuitively creating an experiment sounds like the way to start, but could be a lot of information at once.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I hope that if you're listening and you are interested in understanding group dynamics in the context of AI systems, then you go and check out Deliberate Lab. Let's get into the challenges of designing web studies featuring live cohorts, because I think part of the reason this has taken so long to be addressed as an experimental problem, or like there not being a framework for good live multi-party web studies, is because it's really difficult to do well. And I think it's interesting perhaps to talk a bit about what bad data looks like in that context. What do you define as low quality data versus what's high quality data? And it might be helpful maybe to specialize that question, because I appreciate it's very broad.
Sure. Well, when we think about online populations, particularly those that are incentivized by a piecewise rate for completing their survey, or it's in their best interest to complete these tasks as quickly as possible, for example, surveys or traditional rater tasks, we wanted to be careful about making sure participants weren't just clicking through the study.
You don't want them to speedrun it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's hard in Deliberate Lab to speedrun things, though. For example, we've put timers on certain stages. You can configure that. Just by nature of many of the flavors of experiments being live, there are waiting stages as you wait for other people to progress. I think that I'm a little optimistic about this, though. One thing we found after the first couple thousand of participants, we're starting to get a flavor of what participants generally act like. And we've gotten a lot of feedback. People will message us on Prolific after and say, hey, that was so fun compared to the other studies that I typically do. And I think the novelty of interacting with other people helps keep that engagement. But that is not always the case. Specifically, one thing we noticed in conversations and in qualities of chat stages in particular is that first chat message really sets the tone, or the first few. I would love to see more guidance on this and literature. Again, evolving space. But if the first person adds a very thoughtful message and things, other people will match that tone and engage, and we'll see a better quality transcript. However, if the first person to message is very breezy with their response, we see a little less engagement, less turns, things like that.
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, you've seen so many participants at this point. my sense is from you that the vast majority of participants actually are engaged and do want to like authentically like, you know, contribute and be part of the experiment.
Yeah.
And it's a minority that are trying to figure out ways to simply get their fee with a minimum of effort. Are there specific, I mean, you mentioned detention checks for one, you mentioned like timers being another. Are there any other things that you've looked at? I copying and pasting as well, preventing copying and pasting. Are there any other things that you've looked at for preventing essentially like, I don't know, adversarial participation in your studies?
Sure. Well, one thing we've played around with in terms of incentives at DeepMind, when we go through human review for all of our studies, it's very important for us to pay not just a minimum wage, but a living wage. So we tend to have higher payouts in aggregate. However, we've thought about how to disperse this payout. Originally, when we were really concerned about click-through rate, and this is like really just stuff we've found through our empirics, like rule of thumb kind of thing. I don't know if these are just hunches, you know. But we've played around with having a minimum base rate with bonuses added in as you complete different steps. Like after you complete this chat stage, you know, we'll give you an extra $2 and then $2 here and $2 here. But in our experience, that doesn't work as well as just promising the full amount up front.
That is surprising to me.
Yeah, that was surprising to us as well. We're really interested in this because, you know, the participants are the most valuable part of these experiments. But yeah, people stream in a lot faster as well with the promised, you know, higher amount. And I think that that has just like carry on positive effects. Like people don't have to wait as long then in the transfer stage to get matched into a group. And so maybe people are happier because of that.
Yeah.
There's less.
They haven't had like say 10 minutes of checking out and then before becoming engaged in the study.
Exactly. Actually, that's one thing. As a experimenter who's transferring people into groups, there's always this like math I'm having to do where you want the people that have been waiting the longest to get put into a group. But after about 5 minutes, I've found they're just not that, you know, I would be the same way. I would kind of lose interest, be a little slower, be a little less engaged.
Interesting. And so I think this is like a super interesting scene, which is there's an enormous amount of like human factors research that could be done that wouldn't shed just light on wouldn't just shed light on deliberate, but on essentially like these like web study tools more generally. I mean, particularly that point about like what the first message setting the tone and participants anchoring against that message.
Right.
I think that's fascinating. Awesome. And presumably, I mean, you've alluded to it a couple of times in the conversation where participants will mention, say, to the experimenter that somebody isn't participating, which is really helpful, you know, so that actually being one of your guards against abuse. And it makes me wonder more generally about, like, feedback that you've gotten from participants that has fed into the design of the tool. Why have you learned from them?
I mean, the central theme is that what participants say they like and what they value may be different from what we think. You know, going back to the wanting people to play this poker game and things like that, and folks wanting reciprocity. This idea that right now these are single interactions with random strangers. In the charity facilitation use case I discussed, for example, there were a lot of different causes on there, from, you know, regional ones to hurricane or disaster mitigation to environments to different subgroups of populations. For example, funding for women or funding for orphans or funding for folks in Sudan. And some of the conversations I would say were a little higher in temperature than others. And we were thinking, would you speak this way if you were speaking to your colleagues? Actually, one evolving research interest of mine is this idea of collective dynamics. You know, Anita Woolley's done some cool work here where, you know, people are going to be different and act different in different scenarios. I'm very different at home than how I am at work, for example.
Right, you're switching between roles.
Right. And you're switching between roles, and also, say you have 4 extroverts in a group who all want to lead. That outcome's...
God forbid.
I know, right? So historically, this research is hard to do at scale because you can't put Jerome in 50 experiments and conversations and settings and see what happens. You're going to get too tired. That's not going to be good.
It would be cruel.
Right.
Yeah.
And, the time that humans need to get all that done is just, virtually impossible. But let's go back to this kind of simulacra research we've been doing, where in certain contexts, large language models are reasonably good if probed correctly to kind of reconstruct some of these aggregate outcomes. Can we use those kinds of simulacra to form hypotheses about the kinds of outcomes we'd see in collective dynamics? I think that this is the kind of research that simulacra could really help to accelerate and enable.
And I think this is probably something to highlight. If you go and run a study using Deliberate yourself, you can use agents as participants. And so you can immediately start testing hypotheses with these simulacra and then transfer them over potentially to studies involving people.
Actually, one thing about that, I mentioned in the charity study that we thought the kinds of good quality data for us were ones where people were engaging a lot, where all of the perspectives were being heard, but it was taking a lot more cognitive effort from the participants. And then when we asked the participants what they preferred, they loved when the AI would make a decision for them and they didn't have to converse so much. I wonder how much of that is because at the end of the day, it's a positive thing, right? Like all this money is being allocated to charities that we have researched, and maybe as a participant you don't have that much skin in the game. You're like, this sounds great, quick consensus, easy money for the charities. There's no incentive for me to have my voice heard if all of the outcomes sound good. I actually wonder what would happen if we had simulacra reproducing these, if they can reproduce the preferences over these modalities, because cognitive load and time constraints are things that probably large language models operate differently in.
Yeah.
They're not trying to get to their next study so they can get paid for the next survey.
They're designed to grind it out and to give their full attention to the task in front of them.
Right.
Sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, no, we haven't, done the simulacra version of this because this is such a fresh study for us. But, that's just an example of potential misalignment that I think would happen.
What's next for Deliberate Lab?
Yeah. Well, in the short term, as we've hinted, there are some new features rolling out, particularly with respect to robust simulated participants. And I'm sure that we haven't covered all of the questions in the space. So if, these kinds of design trade-offs that we've been discussing are interesting to you, listener, please help us contribute and think about the scaffolding for these participants. It's a very rich and unexplored space. Another thing we've been seeing is that, these models are increasing in their multimodal capabilities. There's image generation, which I've seen this week folks in the open source community are contributing. There's voice modalities and video modalities. And once we figure out latency with these multimodal operations, I would love to see that extensibility in the platform. And then finally, this one hasn't been solved yet, is just this idea of longitudinal studies. We've discussed, how do we study situations that are less, transactional tasks with people to more relational dynamics where there are more stakes. And, how can we leverage Prolific efficiently to do that as well?
Interesting. I mean, that's something that we're absolutely keenly interested in, where we appreciate the limitations of, okay, you've got all of these different research questions, but in the context of the tooling historically, it's a often like not a super carefully curated group of people that you've known for like weeks or months or have known each other for weeks and months. And there are all sorts of like interesting things that you can learn by allowing these longitudinal studies where you have groups that can exist for week after week after week, and there are stakes in like their interactions now with regards to how they affect interactions in the future.
Yeah, actually, one interesting detail there. I mentioned this incentive structure I've heard about where, you message someone on Prolific and say, hey, come back tomorrow. I've also heard in a few academic groups of folks curating Prolific lists of, like trusted testers or trusted participants to come back for longitudinal studies.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting tension where on the one hand you want to get participants that you trust, and on the other hand you actually are also interested in statistically getting a sample from the population that's random, and if you're repeatedly using the same person in your studies, then maybe you're limiting the generalizability of your results. But yeah, that is absolutely something that I've come across as well, and I think we're keen to like build it out into a fuller feature of the platform. In the form to support things like longitudinal studies.
We're very much looking forward to that. And actually, one thing I'm hopeful about with this, rollout of the new robust AI simulated participants is we're always really mindful of the pool of remaining participants we have on Prolific, and we don't want to scoop from that. And I mean, luckily there's so many people on Prolific, so usually it's like, we only have 100,000 people left. So we've never exhausted this pool, but we do use a lot of participants to iterate over pilots. Does this work operationally? Did they understand the instructions? And we're hoping that AI simulated participants can help streamline some of the piloting there.
Yeah. I think there's a whole line of research of like, repeated exposure to experiments. How does it affect engagement in future ones? Because I feel like there probably is a muscle that does get trained of like familiarity, where you aren't surprised by like these experimental features that a person new to the platform would be surprised by.
Exactly.
Awesome. And to reiterate, you are seeking contributions to Deliberate Lab. And so, you've got these things coming in for multimodality, you've got the simulated participant features being rolled out. Users can look forward to trying out both of those. But for the longitudinal stuff, potentially we could talk a bit more about that. And if anybody listening is interested in that as well, definitely reach out to myself or Crystal. We'd love to talk about it. Awesome. And so shifting focus away from the tool and onto research using the tool, what timely research questions do you think it could be used to answer? How might Google DeepMind or the broader community use it to test things that they're interested in or that people more generally interested in?
Yeah. So, at Google DeepMind, there's teams like us that are doing this research in behaviors and outcomes for humans. But as you know, there's also teams that are building these frontier models. So one thing I'd really like to see is a expansion of the scope of what evaluation might look like in this space. I don't know how this would work in particular, but for example, right now, a lot of these models are evaluated in these static single-user RLHF datasets. And as models are being used in social dynamics, it may be appropriate to test them dynamically in groups settings or in less static settings. So Deliberate Lab is suited for, testing model checkpoints to make sure that the model updates are continually benefiting users. Right now, a lot of these hill climbing evaluations are like, can the model improve its capabilities in X amount on this particular task? Obviously, human dynamics and checkpoints are harder, but it would be cool if the questions we were asking when we roll out a model are, how much did this improve users on this task? And making the benchmarks more human-centric.
Very interesting. Yeah, augmentation evaluations rather than focusing exclusively on just testing the system in isolation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's not really a convergence of what constitutes a good metric or evaluation for a group setting. There are a few rules of thumb that we use sometimes. For example, we can use qualitative data from surveys. We often reach back for TAM, the technology acceptance model, to measure satisfaction. There's Dian et al.'s Trust in Automation, which is a helpful survey tool. But I think that Prolific is also working on a few evaluations.
This is true,
here.
yeah. I mean, you saying that definitely reminds me of an analogy with some of the work that Nora's been doing on essentially a leaderboard that doesn't have some of the failure modes that other leaderboards, such as like Ella Marina, do have. And so the leaderboard that she's developed, Humane, is essentially asking like, oh, how do preferences vary according to demographic factor, and how does like usage vary according to demographic factors, to give like a much richer view of preferences in choice of model than you would get from like that single ranking on a leaderboard. And yeah, I think there's definitely an analog between, and also not just like measuring it in a single respect either, getting that multi-dimensional measurement of, oh, you know, was the conversation like, did it respect the safety training? Did it, was it like particularly helpful? Was it an enjoyable interaction? Yeah, I think that definitely connects with this problem that you talk about with like, oh, a group interaction. How do you measure if a group interaction is good or not?
Right.
It's like a single scale is probably going to be fairly reductive. And so like looking at lots of different ways that you can quantify how good an interaction is for the people involved or for some other party.
Deliberate Lab at DeepMind, we see this as an opportunity to test these models as we develop them. But for the broader community that aren't necessarily working on developing frontier models, there's so much research I'd love to see in this space. There's so much we don't know about social capabilities. We know that group capabilities are not the sum of individual interactions. A model that may seem very personable and helpful in a single user interaction may be very domineering in a conversation when there's 5 people. So what is the extent of these social capabilities? In terms of opportunities, can large language models mediate a debate or improve a conversation in some way? Can it de-escalate conflict? I think these are a lot of, high stakes questions that I would love to see answered, and hopefully Deliberate Lab provides a useful jumping off point for researchers wanting to do that.
I think one of the things I find interesting about like a tool like that is trying to ensure that the models respect privacy of, and can identify what information is confidential,
Yeah.
and like the information boundaries, if you like, and getting them to do it really reliably and robustly.
Yeah.
Particularly in the context of, where we're at with like jailbreaking, where jailbreaking is still a problem. And, even with instruction hierarchies and all of this, like, training focused on, respect the system prompt over the user prompt, you still end up with cases where, the guardrails get lifted off. Is that something that we should expect on any particular timeline? I mean, you say not to expect it at all, so...
Recently I've been seeing that these language models have increased capabilities, specifically with respect to tool use, with respect to retrieval augmented generation. So now they can access our calendars. They can access more context, documents, memories, history. And I'm wondering if this allows us to move this facilitation more upstream. Like, instead of just intervening once we are in a conversation, how'd we get to this conversation in the first place? Why are we in this conversation? Do we all want to be here? Are the right people in the room with the appropriate context? I'm interested in this idea of orchestrating. When we first started thinking about the kinds of opportunities that AI facilitation could provide, I was thinking about situations where AI do have these capabilities. For example, analytical capabilities that allow them to trade better, or opportunities to see past human biases and make better decisions. But it's not just decisions where AI are better than humans or have exhibited superhuman capabilities. There's also things we don't want to do. Like, maybe I don't want to tell the person that runs this meeting that I really don't like their meeting because there's emotional stakes,
I think it's so interesting when you think about like how people are using these models in their lives, their personal lives, let alone like at work, where people are bringing their problems to them and they are
Yeah.
talking to them about, oh, please advise me on this like social situation. But it's in that one-on-one setting at the minute. It's yet to be in a setting where the other person is in the same session with the model. So I think that is absolutely fascinating. And I also see like the opportunities at work as well. It's yet to be the case that you have a model in, say, your Slack that is helping to coordinate or is highlighting things that are getting dropped or overlooked or just like bad plans being suggested.
Right.
Yeah.
And I promise that my entire research agenda is not motivated by me wanting to build an agent that tells people I can't attend more meetings.
Yeah.
But that would be a nice byproduct.
Yeah. Excellent. And so I've got 2 questions for our wrap up. And the first one is about advice to an early career researcher. So what's one piece of advice you'd give to an early career researcher interested in making AI a good thing for people, particularly as it's becoming so influential?
Don't chase the AI frontier. The capabilities of these models are changing so quickly that I think if you want to, build AI that's beneficial for humans, we should focus on the human part of it because that's a little slower to change. I'll roast myself here. I think a year ago, a study of mine was published where I was studying how developers could use AI systems in their work. And one of the findings was, hey, AI isn't that good at math. Maybe we shouldn't we should appropriately calibrate trust in more analytical scenarios. Now, how was I to know that these models would become so good at math in the span of a few months and before the study was published? So I guess that advice to not chase the frontier is very directly motivated by my past work here. And just more generally, there's so much tooling and capabilities and technology at our disposal here that it can be overwhelming to think about what to prioritize. So just keep the focus on, augmenting the human potential, not so much leveraging whatever capability is hottest this week.
It's an interesting, I feel like, meta-scientific problem, how quickly things are changing and trying to bring to bear the methods of science on an artificial object that is constantly developing, right?
Right.
And you make a claim about language models one year, and then that claim is outdated a year later and seriously outdated. And trying to scope claims as well. Are you talking about a specific language model or models in general?
To that point, I think I'll just say some stuff here.
No, go for it.
Yeah. And I think that this has been something that's been challenging for researchers in this space as well. Just because these models have been advancing so quickly, I find that a lot of the relevant research I'm studying these days are in the form of preprints. So we as an academic community need to consider how we want to establish more rigor and peer review given how rapidly these technologies are progressing.
It's very interesting. I think particularly as you're seeing more and more essentially AI-driven research, and I guess you've probably seen like the furore around ICLR, where there are loads of reviewers that are seemingly just like using LLMs, and there are loads of like LLM submitted papers. And it seems like there's yet to be an answer to that of like a forum where, I don't know, it could be, for example, somewhere where it's just like accepted that it is like AI generated research and you have different tools running over the top of it to try and surface things that are particularly useful to people visiting. Awesome. So the second point was actually a point and not a question. I did not have two questions in this section. I had 2 points. The first one was a question, but the second one is just a thank you. Thank you, Crystal, for coming on the podcast. And thank you to the broader team in Google that developed Deliberate. I am super excited to see what people are going to build with it, how they're going to contribute. I encourage you again to go and check it out for yourself, even just to run a little experiment. It'll be super easy. And yeah, I look forward to the things that your group produces in the future as well. Very exciting.
Thanks so much, Jerome. This was such a pleasure.